Alrighty, so I'm going to part one of my breakdown of Darth Dawkins' pre-sup script. We're going to do today. So I've clipped together his openings from about six different debates, discussions he's had. First one was one I was supposed to be in, but because of James over at Modern Day Debate screwing up the date, sending me one date and sending Darth a different one. We're right here. So we're going to go through these here. Going to build this up, build these into some live response videos. I'm going to clip some more stuff together and going to build it from here. So this is going to take the introduction and kind of the core of Darth's argument and break it down.
I have to say thanks to Shannon. She honestly helped us out. I don't deserve it. So thank you. I screwed up. I told Red Vencher it would be tomorrow. I told Darth it would be tonight. And then it was like, oh, wait, no, I've screwed this up. And Red's like, I can't do it tonight. And so I was like, Shannon, can you bail us out? We're in trouble. And she said, fine, I'll help you. So I am so...
That tone of voice.
No.
That was the exact tone of voice. I was typing just like that.
I made that part up. But we're so thankful. So with that, I want to say thanks again to our speakers for being here. Thank you guys both for being here. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks.
Oh, thank you.
You betcha. So Darth, with that, we will set the clock for a 10 minutes, roughly 10 minutes. But as you said, you don't have to use all 10 minutes, and the floor is all yours.
No, just I'll need 60 seconds. The triune God of the Christian scriptures, who exists, who created this world, has revealed himself through natural revelation, all of creation. The heavens declare the glory of God, Psalm 14, Romans 1. And he is the necessary preconditions for all viability of facts and intelligibility of facts, and the denial of which leads to complete metaphysical collapse and unintelligibility, absurdity.
Alrighty, yeah, I'll be
All
short
right,
and sweet.
so
I
that
usually
first
don't have a long
one-
introduction.
Oh,
We're
God
just
damn it. This doesn't work the same as doing a YouTube vid. So that first 60 seconds wasn't a whole lot into what he's going to argue, but what he's laid out, at least, in that bit... is, or at least how he tries to put it through, is he's kind of laying the foundation for kind of the coherent disargument that presuppers use. I have to go back through. I didn't hear him say the other bit, so we'll do this again.
Again,
Get
to our
this.
speakers for being here. Thank you. 10
Let's get
minutes, roughly 10 minutes, and the floor is all yours.
No, just I'll need 60 seconds. The triune God of the Christian scriptures, who exists, who created this world, has revealed himself through natural revelation, all of creation. The heavens declare the glory of God, Psalm 14, Romans 1. And he is the necessary preconditions for all viability of facts and intelligibility of facts, and the denial of which leads to complete metaphysical collapse and unintelligibility, absurdity.
All right. So that first bit, there's not a lot here. So if you get into a discussion with them, a couple things he's set up, or that what he's arguing for in that first 60 seconds. We'll get more of that argument. I'll suss out here in some of these other opening statements. So the first bit, so part of it is the there's going to hold up is natural and special revelation, right? So what you see out in nature points to God, which is weird because Duncan atheism, Darth Dawkins, Darwin's deity also went under the name evolution false, right? So when arguing with Darth, you're going to have to get him on some of that stuff because he would be denying some of that natural revelation. So by his own argument, his falls apart, right from the get-go, just from that bit. There's other parts he's going to lay out, and we're going to get through here. But what he's arguing for here, and what he does differently, is that he doesn't, doesn't typically use the language, the terminology that is used for some of these arguments by philosophers. And part of that is to confuse you, to kind of throw you off because you're like, well, what's this? What's that? Especially with things like ultimate things here. So to break some of this down, he's obviously talking about metaphysical necessity, right, is what God is and what he's going to argue for. And a good chunk of those arguments are Thomas Aquinas' arguments, right? And so there's places we can attack when discussing Darth to expose his shitty shitty argument, right? And what's up here. But you got to be willing to target those things and not just go with what you want to say about your own belief, which is a mistake a lot of atheists that discuss with him go with it, right? You got to know this stuff, and obviously you got to know what you believe, right? Because in any discussion back and forth, those things are going to come up.
Alrighty. Yeah, I'll be short and sweet. I usually don't have a long introduction. Jim and I are discussing atheism versus Christianity. I hold to the Christian worldview, that Christianity is not only true, but it's the only reasonable and rational worldview to hold, in virtue that the God of the Bible exists and he has revealed himself both in natural and special revelation.
Again, that natural and special revelation. So one of the points to harp on here is that natural revelation with him and ask questions about it, right? So in my discussion or my plan when talking about him, because I've watched plenty of other Darth stuff in prep for that first debate that I didn't get to have. So the man, I don't know why this is all weird when I put it in. Oh well. He's gonna what was I gonna say? The one thing is obviously the evolution flaws, but there's other things he's gonna bring in here that God means here. He might even do it in this particular introduction. I know he does it in the Florida Man one, but you want to call him on that, because the first thing I would have asked, about it is if he holds to the book of nature, the book of scripture theology, right? And so in that theology, we are supposed to take and learn from the book of nature, right? So that's God's revelation to us to go back and reinterpret scripture and get our interpretation of scripture right, because scripture isn't wrong in that belief there and stuff here. So when nature says, hey, evolution's a thing, evolution's what happens, our job under that theology is go back and reinterpret scripture, right? Darth doesn't do that. Darth doesn't hold to that, but it's important to get him on the record about whether or not he holds to that position, right? Because we can build from there and undermine the natural revelation, right?
And the denial thereof is impossible. So if one denies that you cannot prove God, then you won't be able to prove anything. It's a reductio ad absurdum. So if someone is familiar with natural revelation, they're familiar with special revelation, that's all they need to know, that the God of the Bible exists. It's that simple. Deny it, and you're going to be in an abyss of absurdity. Okay.
I mean, in that here, he's going to have to show, right? So going back to the metaphysical necessity that is underpinning much of Darth Dawkins' argument. A lot of the arguments from them are from Aquinas, right? And Aquinas has a certain understanding of God and what this metaphysical necessity needs in order to be God. It's called, it's divine simplicity, and it's pretty rigid, so rigid, in fact, that Aquinas had to say that if people that call God the Creator or God their Lord are mistaken, it's a poor use of language, right? Because if we could say those things about God with our language, then God loses his simplicity, right? And thus cannot be that metaphysical necessity. So that's one point you're going to want to hammer on as well when we get into when he starts talking about irreducible ultimates here in some of these other opening statements, right? But that's one thing to keep in mind. Now, my way to deal with it, right? There's two ways. A, you don't have to accept that a metaphysical necessity is necessary, right? Infinitism, right? We can have an infinite regress, can be a thing, right? And with that infinite regress, the metaphysical physical necessity goes away. But infinite regress is awfully hard to defend, right? The arguments for it are pretty complex and tough, and seen as most atheists don't engage a lot with philosophy and doing this stuff. It doesn't work to go up against, because Darth's not going to understand this stuff either and make the arguments here. You're going to have to really be on your point to argue infinitism. The other way is to accept that metaphysical necessity, that really strict and rigid metaphysical necessity. Now, I like to go, and I call that the metaverse, in which everything lives in and is as the metaphysical necessity. It resolves everything that those arguments for the existence of this metaphysical necessity needs, right? And it doesn't violate that simplicity that Aquinas is required, right? And so, if you can bring the argument to this metaverse, right? It's not limited by time. It's not anything like that. It's infinite, and it doesn't. So one of the things, Richard Carrier tried to do, the universe is our local space-time, but we know our universe is expanding because of dark energy, and thus our universe, our local space-time, cannot count as that prime mover, the metaphysical necessity. That's required. So that's why I say metaverse, because if I say universe, they're going to think just this local space-time, and universe is different things. And I wouldn't say multiverse, because it's, whether or not multiverse actually exists, we don't know, and how that works. That's not a thing there, but the metaverse, all that stuff can exist in that thing, in the metaverse, and it's just these universes crop up and build and expand within the metaverse, and the metaverse isn't creating it; it's just there and it sustains it, and these things happen within, right? So that's what I would take if you're not going to argue infinitism, right?
You'll have to forgive me. I'm still recovering from a cold and may cough a little bit. Okay, my position is really just very, very simple. The God of the Bible exists because he has revealed himself in natural and special revelation. Anyone who denies that won't even have the grounds to affirm or deny anything. All facts necessarily indicate God. And God has spoken to various individuals throughout the course of human history, and it's been recorded sovereignly, inerrantly, and infallibly. And it is self-attesting. The only reason why somebody would reject that is because they would be reasoning from autonomous reasoning, which I will demonstrate tonight is simply fallacious. So that's all I have to say.
How's it going, That's amazing. Oh, okay. Let me go back there. Get that last little bit.
Have the grounds to affirm or deny anything. All facts necessarily indicate God, and God has spoken to various individuals throughout the course of human history, and it's been recorded sovereignly, inerrantly, and infallibly. And it is self-attesting. The only reason why somebody would reject that is because they would be reasoning from autonomous reasoning, which I will demonstrate tonight is simply fallacious.
All right, so there's a couple of things here. A couple of tracks that when he does this kind of opening and what he's trying to push, and then things to do and understand here, right? So the first thing that it was spoken by God to people, and it was recorded inerrantly and all that other stuff. So if he's going full-blown evangelical fundamentalist and reads that what's written, plain on the page is, what it means, and it's not, like we don't take the book of nature, book of scripture position. He's going to have a lot of problems demonstrating that he knows that it was what's communicated in the Bible was what God told those people, right? He's going to have to defend that position. He won't ever defend that position. He'll just assert that that's the case, but that's one position that you can hammer him on. On the Presupper argument, it's garbage. It's not good. Darth knows a little bit of philosophy and will use it to try to run over atheists, right? And so part of this series is to kind of break down some of the arguments he's making, because Darth likes to use arguments that are or use terminology that's not the same as being used by the philosophers or theologians and stuff, right? So he'll say things like ultimate and irreducible when describing a metaphysical primary, right? So one of the things you want to get on Darth is his understanding of divine simplicity, because that's what he's trying to describe for the prime mover. And I said a little earlier that even Aquinas himself has to make a special pleading argument, not necessarily in the logic of the five ways, but in things like saying God's the creator, God's Lord, right? If you say those things, God doesn't have the simplicity necessary to satisfy the prime mover in Aquinas's five ways, right? And so you can hammer him on that. And like I say, I bring, you can either make the tough argument in favor of infinite regress, which I think is really tough. I think it's a possibility, but it's something that I don't feel comfortable arguing. Instead, I argue for a metaverse that meets all the requirements of simplicity necessary to work within Aquinas' five ways, more so than God. Now, the argument he has to demonstrate that God satisfies that, and so we'll break some of those down in some of his other arguments here. But where else was I going on the thing said here? Let's see what he said again.
The reason why somebody would reject that is because they would be reasoning from autonomous reasoning, which I will demonstrate tonight is simply fallacious.
All right, no, and I watched this debate. He doesn't do it, and we'll get into some of these at a later stream. I broke these down as best I could to make them manageable, because it's about 10 minutes, and so it'll be about 40 minutes talking about it, and it's going to turn into a YouTube video, and so I don't want to go much longer than that. But the autonomous reasoning thing, right? So he's going to... This is the argument, if you remember the Destiny debate he had with him about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago now at this point. But a lot of this is easy to attack for presuppers, atheists and stuff like that, because they don't have a theory of justification or that can be down. Like, so the big ones are like foundationalism, coherentism, and correspondence, right? And so in there you have to know which one of the Munchausen trilemma that you're willing to take. Infinitism, arbitrariness, or circularity. So in traditional precept arguments, circularity is what they use, because they're using a coherentist model, right? So how their theory model reflects all the facts and all that stuff and is coherent, right? And so they'll argue against the incoherency of other things, and that's what Darth tries to do, right? So I'm probably, if I was going to describe myself, probably a foundationalist, right? So the foundationalism is a blending of foundationalism and coherentism. The idea being that foundationalism is answering certain questions here, and coherentism is answering other questions, and then you can have both of them and that stuff there. So like when I argue against the existence of God, and one of the arguments that you would bring up when he starts talking about possibility, we'll deal with in the longer one. One of his longer introductions is like the logical problem of evil, right? That's a coherentist argument that shows the omnigod is not coherent and thus doesn't exist, right? And that's something you can defend. But it's something that gets missed out on what does possibility and impossibility is another thing he's going to bring up, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But yeah, for the autonomous reasoning, if you go, hey, and foundationalism is here, I have this set of axioms or properly basic beliefs, right? And so this is how we do math, this is how we do science, this is how we do logic, right? We have these axioms of these systems, and then from there we can derive other knowledge and other truths and stuff, right? And so one of the arguments to bring up, he doesn't do it quite in his introductions. That's something he'll try to bring up later in when his interrogation of a person goes on. And so it's not going to come up here and stuff here, but the one thing to do is logic, right? We have different logics that don't use the classical laws of logic, right? So There's, classical logic. We have, law of identity, law of non-contradiction, and law of excluded middle. They're not actually laws that are inviolable or anything like that. They're more principles and axioms of logic, right, and how the system works. Right, so we have multivariate logics that do away with the law of excluded middle, where it's either A or not A would be the answer in classical logic, right? That's what you're looking for. But you can have multivariate logics that can give you like if we do like the atheist, theist, agnostic, right, on a position of does God exist? Well, based on, so we have logics that can do that. Furthermore, especially in quantum mechanics, we have logics that loosen the law, quote unquote, of non-contradiction, right? These are dialectic paraconsistent logics. And so if you think in quantum mechanics, one of the things is Schrodinger's cat, right? So you don't know if the cat is dead or alive in the box until you observe it, right? So it's both dead and not dead. So that would be a contradiction. And in traditional logic, with the principle of explosion, would mean that you can say either of those things are true, and thus the logic falls apart. Whereas in these dialectic models of logic, we can still say something about that. We can still deduce future information and stuff from this contradiction. Now, the question becomes, and it's still an open question in philosophy, whether true contradictions actually exist or not, right? Darth will argue they don't anyway here, but and why we say why it's an open argument is because are you a scientific realist, whereas like our models of science actually describe reality as it is, or are you an instrumentalist, which an instrumentalist is somebody that is like, well, these are just models that work, right, and aren't necessarily indicative of reality as a whole. Right, so we may using dialectic logic to deal with this instrument, this model, so that we can derive stuff from it because it's the best model we have at the time here, right? And so we might find out later, well, that no, true contradictions don't exist, right? But for right now, that's an open question, right? And a lot of people don't know that, right? In his most recent one with Snake was right, Snake argued that the classical laws of logic are things that apply to everything. And it's like, well, no, these other logics exist, and we do it here. But Darth believes the same thing, so he can't bring that stuff up and make that argument. So we'll get here. But then for the autonomous reason stuff and foundationalism, so... and that's kind of what I was building on here, is from these sets of axioms, these laws of logic, we can deduce new information and stuff like that, right? And so even if all three of the classical laws of logic are completely arbitrary, we can still deduce new information from them, right? That'd be the one thing to take.
So that's all I have to say. Okay, my position is that the Christian worldview is the only coherent worldview in order to have viable and intelligent.
So this is one of the few times that he says coherence. So if you've dealt with them and you don't understand coherentism, understand coherentism before dealing with them, and you'll understand the type of argument he's making. A lot of people will try to argue he's arguing circular, right? And thus it's not valid or can't be done thing here, but like I said, this goes back to the Munchausen trilemma. You have to pick one of those three horns, and a coherentist is going to pick circularity at the bottom, right? So arguing that stuff isn't the route to take and to deal with that playbook. What you'd have to do is work within coherentism itself as a framework, and to show that his is incoherent, right? And we'll get to that a little bit here, and I'll lay that out here, and especially when we get into how his script goes elsewhere in these debates. I'll do, this week I'll cut up those bits, and then next week's stream I'll do, I'll break down each little bit along the way.
Eligible propositions and predications. The reason why it is the only coherent worldview is because the God of the Bible who exists has revealed himself in natural revelation, wherein all facts indicate that one true God.
Again, Darth Dawkins goes by the name Evolution Falls, and the facts in the natural world points to evolution being true. So, in here, he has an issue with whether or not, he's denying, quote unquote, God's revelation, God's natural revelation, right? So that denial renders his worldview incoherent, right there. And you hit him on that too. And then he gets pissy about that with his trolls. If you ever get on him on this stuff, he'll call you a troll and he'll block you and he'll leave you out. But I mean, that's where you go, isn't it? Like, right? He's developed something that's completely incoherent when he rejects evolution. And there's other things too that he'll bring up if you don't get to the evolution part, and we'll discuss it here. But in one of these, I forget, I think it's the Florida Man opening, where he brings up the uniformity of nature. So we'll get to that and we'll discuss it there.
And God has additionally revealed himself in special revelation through the course of history, whereby he caused over 40 different authors to record objectively and accurately and infallibly his interaction with them.
How did he cause that, right? Like, he's got to justify that cause, right? Randolph does not do good. I love Randolph. Randolph's a good guy. But he's not ready to have these kind of conversations, right, with people like Darth.
And it functions as the final authority. So my position will be that to deny this will cause one's position to just drop into an abyss of absurdity. It will be reduced to an absurdity. While my opponent will probably try to represent his atheism as a lack of belief, claiming to be neutral. By claiming to be neutral, he's made an indirect claim that the mind of man can reason without necessitating or referencing God as the irreducible, indispensable primary.
Yep. So when he sings the irreducible, indispensable primary, he's talking about divine simplicity. So you're going to have to hammer him on his conception of simplicity, right? In any discussion, right? Like I said, the Aquinas version is really restrictive, like so restrictive. So like a lot of, that's why it's, Thomism isn't really in vogue, amongst, Christians, right? So you'll get things instead like the Kalam, cosmological argument. The Kalam argument doesn't, falls apart in other ways, but basically what they try to do is get rid of, it's like, oh man, this, it's basically famously, Alvin Plantinga's, argument that, the simplicity of Aquinas and the likes, renders God just a property, right? And not an actual being, that they're trying to argue for. And I agree with that argument, right? The God in that description is just a property. And the way that you try to do it, he can't be what you want the Christian God or what you say the Christian God is, and still be the metaphysical necessity that Aquinas is arguing for. So you gotta nail him on that, right? So if he does that, if he says no, I'm with like Plantinga and William Lane Craig's view on God, then the 5 ways arguments that he gets the prime mover from, they're gone, right? He's stuck with a either Plantinga's modal ontological argument or Craig's Kalam. And those ones are easier information and stuff. So like the Kalam fails because it assumes a strict A theory of time. And current evidence and stuff points to that it's neither a strict A theory of time nor a strict B theory of time that we live in. So we have a blended A-B theory of time, right? I think this is called the, the Copenhagen interpretation in physics. And so without a strict A theory, the Kalam falls apart, right? And so you can argue that against there too. And for the modal stuff relies on a very questionable axiom in modal logic. S5 is not widely accepted. It's very highly contested. And so there's arguments you can find that they'll contest why we would use axiom S5 as part of this modal logic that Plantinga uses for his ontological argument. But that's the one thing you want to stick on him and find out and get after him on.
My opponent will either have to have his reason will have to be irreducibly.
And then reasoning without the mind of God, that's possible, right? So I brought up earlier the existence of, say, a metaverse that would meet all the requirements necessarily in simplicity for Aquinas' arguments to work and still wouldn't be God, right? And so there I have a foundation without God that I can still reason, right? And if I bring that up, I would imagine he would, in an argument, would go after me on Hume's problem of induction, right? And you know what? All I say to that is that I assume those things, right? That's a foundational belief, right? And so I assume the future is going to be like the past, and therefore I can, from that, derive the different things the way we do in induction. Now, obviously things can change. I may not have all the information, and so something in the future may require me to revise the things I know. Or not necessarily know, but believe. And that's not a problem with that. And if he tries to make it a problem in any argument, you'll have to bring up, because Darth also believes that God intervenes, i.e. miracles. But he also believes that God's existence means the uniformity of nature is true, doesn't change, and thus the problem of induction is solved. So he has a huge contradiction between miracles are possible and the uniformity of nature is true because God exists, right? He says uniformity and stuff, but he's basically talking about the past is going to be like basically like the future, and it's not going to change. So the things that work now aren't going to change tomorrow, which fails, with miracles.
Primary or ultimate, or he doesn't have a necessary primary in order to invoke anything. And one other thing, what he will most likely attempt to do is not want his worldview to be examined or questioned or the basis of his propositions.
This is Darth. This is Darth just being the pot calling the kettle black, right? In this situation.
Okay, I'll just keep it nice and short.
So this is going to be the long one. This is where he's going to hit on a couple other topics that he's going to constantly try to hammer home on, right? And these are things you got to think about if you're ever going to talk to someone like Duncan Atheism, right? Now, he's a different presupper than, say, like Sci-10 Bruggencade. There's different ways to handle Bruggencade and how he handles stuff.
The God of Christianity has revealed himself in natural and special revelation. In natural revelation, God has constructed the world where all facts indicate himself as the metaphysical primary of all secondary and temporal facts.
Again, Darth denies evolution, so he's denying a bit of God's natural revelation, and therefore his argument is incoherent. So either his God is wrong, or God is wrong. I mean, his God doesn't exist as he thinks it exists, and therefore he's got to jump in and make arguments and either defend and justify the things that he thinks atheists can't justify and defend, right? Because like the natural revelation does not point to God then, right? He's given up that point. What was the other thing I was going to say? Oh man, what was the other thing he was saying? I was going to say, I lost it. Or he's going to accept that, or he's going to have to provide some way that God tells him that we're being fooled by the facts, and he's going to have to demonstrate something that, like I said earlier, he's going to have to demonstrate that he knows that God caused them to write the Bible inerrantly incorrect, and so that reading it straightforward like a biblical literalist would, that he knows that's true that way, right? So he's going to have to demonstrate that cause there. But in this instance, he's going to have to demonstrate how God has told him and how he knows God has told him that even though nature points to evolution, it actually points to God, right? So he's got those two problems right then and there with denying evolution.
Excuse me. I'm still getting over a cold. Because we are personal and possess rationality and apprehension of these temporal and secondary facts, they necessitate that the metaphysical primary, God, is personal as well.
He's got to demonstrate that. There's nothing in that argument that follows, right? That we're personals, that we're thinking minds, and therefore a mind has to be responsible for it. That's an argument he's going to have to make. This is something he should never bring up that way. He'll bring it up in the course of the debate, but if he does to you, he's got to demonstrate that we have in a mind, we being individual personal beings, that thus the metaphysical necessity in his argument must also have those traits, even when the arguments that would point to a metaphysical necessity, Aquinas' 5 ways, get in the way of that, right? Like I said, there's problems with it, as I already pointed out earlier, there's problems with it that he can't get over.
Otherwise, we would not be personal. Rejecting this by implication claim, the impersonal primary ultimate would have to beget or produce the personal. Claiming directly and indirectly that the impersonal primary...
and that's pretty easy for life and all this other stuff when talking about evolution, right? So this is him denying, facts that we can see in nature, right? And not willing to accept other things like the problem, the mind-body problem, right? In philosophy and how to deal with it, right? And there's problems on our ends with dealing too, but we at least have some evidence from the physical world on how minds arise and are kind of what's the term? Emergent properties of more complex minds or brains, excuse me. But this is something he's going to have to demonstrate that he'll never demonstrate. And so in debates like this, hammer home on him on those things.
Ultimate begets or produces a personal is not coherent, nor can it be defended.
He has not pointed out how that's incoherent at all in this argument. He just asserts it. So hammer him home on this point if he ever makes this point in discussion with you, that he's got to justify that. And just saying God is not how it works, is he provided an argument that wasn't necessary to assume God in the first place, right?
God's special revelation, culminating in the Christian scripture, the Bible, informs us of God's necessary attribute set, which is required for human intelligibility. If my opponent either outright denies or merely lacks belief in God, or the God of the Bible, then he'll be necessarily required to present and defend his metaphysical primary and its attributes. In the absence of doing this, he will be without grounding or basis to assert any possibility or impossibility, thereby plunging himself into...
possibility and impossibility are things, where is it? I had the... right here. So this is a quick Britannica intro on what's possible and kind of the understanding in philosophy. So I'm going to read from this. So possibility in logic and metaphysics is one of the fundamental modalities involved in the explication of the opposition between necessity and contingency. In logic, possibility implies the absence of a contradiction. Such definitions as the possible is that which either is or will be true, and that which is not prevented by anything from happening, even if it does not happen, right? So, in this understanding of possibility, right, what we can argue is, based on, based on these specific, laws of physics or laws of this, and how this works, it's possible for this to be a thing, or it's impossible for this to happen, right? So, some of the restraints say in evolution, like on the size and how big something can grow, right? So we, back during the Cretaceous and Triassic stuff with the dinosaurs, we had, was it 6-foot dragonflies and stuff like that, or something like that, or 6-foot wingspan dragonflies? They can't grow that big now, and part of that is the condition of how they breathe in oxygen, right, through their skins, and that back then oxygen levels in the atmosphere were much higher, which allowed them to grow that big. Right, and so just a couple of those things, and that understanding of possibility, we can describe from that information, and we can do this from like a foundationalist perspective, from a set of foundations. Like we do this with science all the time, because of Hume's problem of induction. So we do things like in science, the 3 fundamental assumptions or axioms are that oh God, why am I drawing a blank on this? Is bad when I'm doing these videos. Natural things that happen in nature have a natural cause, kind of thing. We can learn about them by studying nature. And then models of nature that are more predictive are the models of nature that are more accurate, in predictions, are better than models that have no predictive capability, right? And I'd probably, mix those up, a couple things together, but those are generally the 3 primary axioms, assumptions that we make when we do science, right? But from there, we can develop models, and then from those models, we can, determine what's possible and what's impossible, right? Based on that. Now, there might be issues in a model that problems arise, so even in like when Newton presented gravity, there were still issues with his gravity that he knew at the time. Like, what planet is it Venus or Mercury? That what's the term? It's not recession. Somebody in chat will know. But his model of gravity couldn't understand that, right? And so he basically said, well, that's God, God's thing, right? So even if we know the problems are there, in certain instances, like we know, even with like relativity and stuff like that, Einstein stuff, from general relativity and the creation of special relativity, we knew that the model wasn't complete, but it made more accurate predictions than Newton's model, right? It matched more of that stuff going on, and it made better future predictions, even if there's some issues on the outside. But I mean, that's how we would determine what's possible and impossible from that description. Now, this moves on to, according to Aristotle, possibility is to be understood in relation to necessity, whereas a necessary proposition predicates something of things' essence, as in all humans are mortal, right? And so that's a necessary. So the mortality of humans is a necessary part of being human, right? Of being alive. We're all going to die, right? A possible proposition predicates something of a thing that is merely accidental, as in some humans are tall, right? Not all humans are tall. Not all humans are things like that, right? So that's his understanding of possibility, right? And how we can argue things that are possible or not possible. And all we need is like, humans exist, and it's possible to be 6'8", right? For some humans to be 6'8", but it's not something essential to what it means to be a human. And then we get to some philosophers have held that possible things or states of affairs are simply those whose conception involves no contradiction. So if I can conceive something with no contradiction, then it's possible. That's the thing, right? So I could do that without, God being a metaphysical necessity, right? Part of it is, part of the arguments for the existence of God are because we can conceptualize these things with no contradictions, although the Christian God specifically has a shit ton of contradictions and incoherence. Like the Trinity is completely incoherent. As to whether that exists. But from there, that we can do without the metaphysical necessity of God. And that's kind of how we argued through the God potentially existing. So now we're going to talk about empirical possibility, right? So this is kind of some of the stuff I touched on a little earlier, but to determine the empirical possibility of a thing, according to Immanuel Kant, it must be ascertained whether the nature of the thing in question conforms to the condition of actual experience, right? So this is, we can take the models of this here, models of reality, and take from there we can describe what's possible about a certain being or anything like that. So we can do this with God and the likes and other things, right? But we do this things like what the hell is Elon Musk's fucking tunnel that he built, that thing, right? We can go based on everything we know about physics, all this other things and go, this isn't going to be a either efficient or effective way of transportation. It's a dumb way to go through, right? And it's a dumb thing to push for, right? So that's how we determine things are possible or impossible, right? And so in this particular debate, as we get through here, but I mean that's how we do the empirical bit, right? From a set of other facts. It's easy to argue, but not a lot of atheists are going to argue that, right? I don't think it's in here, but in like the previous one when he was talking to Michael, in that debate, Michael brought up a pen, right? And I don't think it was quite possible or anything like that. But I mean, it was with facts, right? So how can you say the pen's a pen? Well, the pen, you can use the quote unquote law of identity and logic, right? That A is A thing is of itself, right? And so if we know what a pen is, when I hold up the pen, I said, I know this is a pen, right? I don't need anything else other than that in understanding God, or in understanding what a pen is.
Complete metaphysical absurdity or incoherence, thereby demonstrating Christianity is true due to the impossibility of its denial.
So, like I've said earlier, because he rejects evolution and he rejects certain aspects of natural revelation, his thing is incoherence, as God's not true, right? And his whole position, his whole argument falls apart based on what he wants to use for justification.
My opponent will continue to make assertions of possibility and impossibility, and I will continue to ask him to provide a basis for these. And that will require him to defend what is metaphysically primary that prescribes any statement of possibility. When he fails or refuses to defend his...
I mean, it's not, from a set of, like I said, as I went through just that quick entry on possibility, there's some other more technical stuff to go through. That's a pretty brief entry. Like we could go through the whole SCP article on how we can describe a possibility. You know what? There's a couple bits, right? There's a couple theories I can bring up and that you can argue in this position, right? Now, learn these things further if you're ever going to debate Darth, but... so what is it here? So, we're talking about the the epistemic question of all the following of these modalities and possibilities. So how does S know that C could have been an L at T, right? And so there's a couple of theories that can work. Maybe multiple of those theories could work, right? Perception. So even though C is not at L, S sees that C could be at L, right? So that's one way we can describe possibility. There's intuition. So even though C is not at L, S has a non-sensory based intuition that C could be at L when S entertains the question, could C have been at L, right? So that'd be more analytical with more of a rationalist approach. Conceivability, right? So this is another one that was mentioned in the short introduction, right? So S can conceive of a scenario in which C is at L. S derives justification believing that C can be at L from conceiving of it, right? So like, things like that. So if I can conceive a, what do I want to say? This object is going to be, this object when it rolls is going to end up over here at such a point in time, right? So I can conceive that happening. And then there's other things that come into my conception and how I conceive these things. Basically other theories and things about reality. Imaginability, right? So this is kind of where the ontological argument originates. Where S to imagine a process whereby C moved from L to L, T or whatever it's, I can't tell on my screen, but S would not arrive at a contradiction. So S is justified in believing that C could have been at L on the basis of imagining the movement, right? Deduction. S can deduce from knowledge of what C is fundamentally and the relevant details about location L that C could have been at L, since that C is not incompatible with it being at L, right? So this is we can deduce from previous knowledge, right? So if it's impossible to jump to the moon or whatever like that, and it's like, well, we know gravity, we know the what is the exit velocity that's needed to do it, and we understand that a person can't jump to the moon because they can't generate the exit velocity needed to escape, or the escape velocity, to get off of Earth to jump to the moon, right? And so from that we can describe what's possible, right? Theory. From S's knowledge of what C is, as well as the relevant facts about the location L, S can come to know that C could have been at L, right? So that's another way. So from a set of theories and stuff we can explain there, right? These are things that understand and defend. Now the article is going to go through and defend on the problems with different things, the limitations of modal knowledge and stuff, which you should look into and all that stuff. But the final one is similarity. So from S's prior observation of objects relevantly similar to C, as well as their actual locations and movement, S can come to know that C could have been at L, right? So these are all ways to deal with possibility and impossibility. A little more complex than just that encyclopedia article. But from there we can say these things. And so understanding this stuff, when you go into Darth Dawkins and start talking to him, you can describe these possibilities. All right, let's finish up the rest here. We're almost done. I think I got one more after this.
Primary, his metaphysical primary, the God of Christianity will be demonstrated by the impossibility of denying him. The God of Christianity will be established by a reductio ad absurdum. And I'm done.
I mean, that wouldn't be a reductio ad absurdum. That's not. I mean, well, I guess, yeah. The incoherence of your idea is reductio ad absurdum, the way you bring to it. But like I said, in all the other examples here, with what Darth wants to argue, you can, pile drive his fucking belief in how he knows and all these other things, to absurdum and ruin it right there. People here. So this is the snake one. I cut out the shitty bit of Darth being a shitty asshole. I imagine Snake is a member of the LGBT community, and that's why Darth decided to quote unquote come out as LGBT, but as the Elohim believing God Trinitarians again. There's something weird that he tried to fit into the LGBTQ label, just being a fucking bigoted asshole.
My opening statement is that the God of Christianity has revealed himself in natural revelation and special revelation.
Again, hammer on that natural revelation. Nobody's going to hammer on the natural revelation, right? That all the facts here, and then he calls himself evolution is false. And I don't know if I brought it up earlier, right? I kind of, get into this stuff and lose track of what I said, but I'll say it here anyways. But we'll do it at the end, because I think he brings up uniformity of nature in this one.
He has revealed that he is the ground of all being and the ground of all knowledge, the ground of intelligibility. And the denial, the non-acceptance, which will amount to the denial thereof, will result in complete metaphysical absurdity. Now, nobody can be neutral about what is ultimate, let alone God. Now, some people will say they lack belief in God, but I'll demonstrate tonight that is an indirect form of denial. So one will either have to accept the revelation of God, that he is the unifying first principle that will provide for all human existence and intelligibility, or one will have to sit there in a state of absurdity, having no grounding for any of their assertions or statements of possibility. And that's it.
Well, I guess there wasn't the uniformity of nature. But if he brings that up, like I said, the natural revelation part is to go after him because the facts in the natural world don't necessarily point to God, right? With evolution and all that other stuff, right? Or at least God is described if you think the Bible is infallible and it's literal, right? So when it says God created man in 6 days and stuff, if you believe that's literal, the natural revelation that supposedly exists contradicts that. And so he's got to demonstrate how he knows that the facts don't actually point that way. The thing that would lead to a contradiction between the natural and special revelation. But what happens, like I grew up Catholic. Yeah, thanks. I grew up Catholic, and so we were always taught the book of nature, book of scripture, and we should always go back and check our interpretation of scripture based on what we learn from the book of nature, right? And that's a pretty prominent Christian theology, not so much in the Protestants' faiths, especially in America, where Darth comes from. I think he's out on the East Coast somewhere. But yeah, so you attack those things, you challenge that, and it goes, that's a sticky point. And he'll get to like the uniformity of nature, right? And we'll bring this up because he gets to it an awful lot in each of these debates. Because he thinks his script, he gets to a point in his script where it's like, oh, they said this here, and so, Hume's problem of induction, they can't justify it. And it's like, I can't. I assume it axiomatically. That's the thing we do, right? But you do the same thing too, Darth. And when he says, and if he says no, I don't do that. God justifies induction, right? And so the problem goes away. When he goes there, you go and ask him, do you believe in miracles? God doing miracles, right? Which he does. I know he does. And so he's going to have to answer yes on that. And when he answers yes on that, you bring up the challenge to how does God justify induction when God can change everything around us from the time right now where I'm talking to, 10 minutes from now, right? So like the laws of physics, nature stuff doesn't work that way, and it could change. Right? So right there you have a contradiction, and God can't justify induction. Right? So his argument falls apart again here. Right? So there's places where his argument falls apart. You just have to understand a bit of philosophy and a bit more than Darth does. But I mean, that's going to do it for part one. I'm going to do over this week. I'm going to cut down some other bits from these debates. And cover each of these talking points because I don't want more than like a 40-minute video on my YouTube doing these things. But yeah, that does it. That's all I have for today.